the method we used was to take a clean version of mainline v4 and then apply our patches onto it afterwards. And that was a very long and very difficult process. Lots of device-specific issues coming up during testing. And so we can now, in hindsight, empirically say, well, actually, if we'd had...
So there's no requirement to contribute back to open source project. You don't have to do that. Most people don't, and that's fine. Just if you have a change.
But two, like, there is a thriving community behind it. And I think one of the things you'll hear in the government space a lot, and they don't do a great job at it, in my opinion, sometimes, is they want...
At some point, you're going to question yourself as an individual, and you're going to have the hard talk. Do you always want to be telling your manager what is open source 101 every single meeting?
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out season 2 episodes with Samson Goddy,
Open source is interesting.
Claire Dillon,
great collaboration,
Wayne Starr,
freedom,
Stephen Wally,
good engineering,
Austen Bryan,
community,
Tom Sadler,
collaboration,
Greg Kroah-Hartman,
The best way to develop software.
Federico Gonzalez Waite,
limitless,
Amanda Brock,
the future,
Gregory Kurtzer,
collaborative,
Michael Dexter,
freedom,
and Kelsey Hightower.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
In this segment, Austen Bryan talks about the benefits of relying on open source and what made the Kubernetes project a good fit for his organization. Did you find Kubernetes or was it brought into your attention by like a vendor or someone else on your team? Like, how did it come into the picture in the first place?
Yeah, hopefully he doesn't mind me bringing him up. But at the time, the Air Force had hired a chief software officer for the first time, which was like a new, and not a technology officer, not a CIO, like those things are pretty normal. But they hired a chief software officer, and his name was Nick Shalon. And he kind of was gathering up programs, doing various software intensive things and trying to standardize the conversation, really is how I would describe it, right? There was a lot of us struggling because we didn't have the tools or knowledge or lexicon or relationships. And I think, he did a great job of bringing like-minded people together across disparate, US-based locations and say, hey, let's at least work together and form kind of a small tribe to talk, like in a way, our own kind of self-formed community. So Kubernetes was thrown at me from him, and I had no idea what it was. I wouldn't say I was tasked to figure it out necessarily either, but it was more like we were trying to build an architecture or reference design at that time of like, what does secure look like for defense and how can industry participate? And so I would say I was part of the machine that was trying to figure that out.
Do you know, like, if the fact that it was open source was a reason why it got thrown at you, or more that there was a recognition that is a widely adopted platform and that was more of the argument towards starting to look into it?
Yeah, I think looking back on it, I would say it's kind of, those things kind of go hand in hand in a lot of ways, right? One, like, it's kind of where the technology ecosystem was moving to at that time, right? Out of VMs and monoliths into containers and microservices and orchestration. So like from a pure, like going back to computer engineering, like it just, for widely distributed large workloads, it just makes sense from a software perspective. But two, like there is a thriving community behind it. And I think one of the things you'll hear in the government space a lot, and they don't do a great job at it, in my opinion, sometimes, is they want dual use technologies, meaning, and what they really mean by that is they want somebody else, they don't want to build things bespoke because it's expensive and they don't want to be a bad steward of taxpayer dollars, right? Like everybody is well intentioned. So they want industry and government to be investing in the same thing so that we can share the cost. Because like money, we do print money in this country, but we don't want to print money, right? Like all of us have a vested interest in not printing money to a degree. And so I say that because I think part of it was like, yeah, there's a huge thriving community. The biggest companies in the world have invested in this technology. It would be silly for the government to be like, no, I'm going to go over here in the corner and like reinvent this wheel that everybody else has decided to adopt. So I think they really become coupled when you make that decision.
In this segment, Tom Sadler talks about his involvement in Inner Source Commons and how his work in the community has been benefiting him and his company as well. Was the BBC supportive all along that you get more and more involved in Inner Source Commons?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of my immediate manager and kind of up the management chain all recognise the value of being involved in an industry group and being able to learn from the kind of best people in the industry on what good inner source practices are and bring them back to the BBC. But also to represent the BBC and show like, we're not just a news company or a TV company, we're a tech company as well. To help with that recruitment and retention, because we've always been a tech company essentially, but a lot of people just assume that we outsource all of our software. So yeah, we want to tell those stories, and especially with the open source and the kind of public service side of things. So yeah, it's giving our knowledge back to the industry, and just being an active participant in the industry. These are all the reasons why I was encouraged to do it. We also have things like 10% time that you can use for things like this. But yeah, I maxed out my 10% time, so hence why I was doing inner source work in my personal time as well.
Is the 10% time to work on upstream things, or is it 10% to work on things that connect but not directly to what you do at work?
The 10% time I'm referring to is just general personal development time. So you could do training courses, do pet projects, learning a new framework, anything like that. But a few of us who are invested in open source use our 10% time for open source.
Do you remember like how you transitioned over into allocating your personal time? Like, was it the community that motivated you, or was there a switch, or it just like happened organically and you were just like in there?
Yeah, I think it was taking on the trusted committer role and helping facilitate the working group meetings. And this is something that I would advocate for actually in open source groups, is having those regular synchronous touch points in the form of something like a working group meeting. So yeah, pretty much all of the inner source commons output is delivered through working groups, and those groups will have regular meetings, invest in mentoring contributors. So I mentioned Russ brought me in through the conference talk, but then Russ was also the kind of lead maintainer of the learning path. So he then mentored me to become a trusted committer, and this whole kind of paying it forward chain of mentoring and training people up to then become the next leaders and the next mentors for people trying to come into the community and make contributions.
In this segment, Kroah-Hartman talks about why it is the most sustainable investment to maintain your open source dependency upstream and the CRA's impact on the local forks.
You work for companies that didn't contribute back to their open source projects. There's no requirement to contribute back to open source projects. You don't have to do that. Most people don't, and that's fine. Just if you have a change that you make that works well for you, it saves you time and money if you do contribute it back. Because if you keep it on your own and teaching people that and showing them that happens, it costs you a little bit more up front, but in the long term, it saves you money. And if you look for the betterment of the company, depending on where your company is in the life cycle of it, it's a hard sell, but it can work pretty well. So there's no requirement that you have to work with the community, but it's nice.
I mean, that is 100% correct. However, when you see, the teams that you work with technically forking the code, making changes in the middle of a bigger platform and never upstreaming those changes, it's really not hard to predict what's going to happen in terms of the maintenance cost. And the company, another division, a separate division at that company did the same thing with another open source project, and it became unmaintainable. And they ran into the problem of the user wanted the upstream version because of whichever feature, and they couldn't port the feature to their forked version. So it wasn't really like you're mandated to contribute back because that is the nice and right thing to do. It was rather, do you want to end up like the other division and drive this thing to the ground? Or you're looking for something that is sustainable in terms of product development. So it was that kind of a challenge that certain parts, if you make changes, that's going to become unmaintainable over time. I don't see how it's not.
Yeah, and your second product is based on the first one. It's not like you're going to do something new every single time. It might be a different team, different project manager, but over the long term, you're going to save stuff. I mean, famously, I talked to some big German company that has lots and lots of divisions, and they joke that they find a new Linux use every week. That division's using Linux over there. Oh, that one's over there. So, it's being used everywhere by these people, but they don't know it's being used. So trying to not necessarily, you don't want to prevent that, but just coalesce it and give the best practices across the company. And here's the company best ways you can do this is a good idea. So you see these larger companies have these open source groups that try and herd those cats that way. And that's a good solution for that type of stuff.
Yeah, and I actually think that the CRA is helping improve that situation with reducing local forks, because local forks cause a slower time to actually do an uplift to the next version because you've got all of the rebasing to do, or you've got backporting to do in some other way. And if you're going to try to stay up to date so that you can give an adequate response to the CVEs that are out on all of those dependencies, it's easier to do if you're up on the most recent version of that dependency, and hence local forking now just made it much more difficult. So
yeah, and work with open source projects that don't break things. So in the kernel, we make the rule, we do not break users. So we made that rule 14 years ago, or maybe longer than that. And we want you never to be afraid to go to the next version. If you go to the next version and your code broke, that's my fault. It's not yours, within reason. But most of the point, we just have a bug right now where something did break. But we don't ever break user space on purpose. Sometimes with security issues, we have to do type of things, and these are rare, and they do happen in some gray area. But we work with open source projects that don't break things. I mean, I hate Python for breaking things all the time.
I was just going to say Python.
Python, I love Perl for that. Perl is stable, and it's not going to work like that, and it's an interesting thing. So pick and choose your sources, your ecosystems of ones that do good engineering practices that don't break things and allow you to upgrade in ways that are going to keep working. Curl is a great thing that everybody relies on, and they don't break things. And hence you can really depend on it and rely on it. Python is tough. Python is really hard. NPM is rough, all the dependency stuff. And dependency chains are going to get, the CRA is calling that out. And I don't think many managers or executives realize their depth of their software development, their bill of materials, and what those chains look like today. And that's a good thing for the CRA. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I hope that those chains get smaller, and I hope that they coalesce on ones that have good engineering practices and rely on it. And again, support those upstream, and then get the good feedback and keep on going for that. And hopefully Python fixes their mess, but I just use a different language.
this segment, Tom Sadler talks about why it is easier and cheaper to do maintenance work in your open source dependency upstream, and what the next step is after getting buy-in from management to do it. I want to go back a little bit to that production side of contributing back. So you talked about that that one less diff that you have to deal with when the new main version comes out of the software that you are depending on. Was there any challenge with like convincing management on the production side that dealing with one less diff is better and it's worth the effort of working on the code upstream as opposed to maintaining a fix and the difference downstream?
I mean, we now have kind of empirical evidence which shows this, since we went from -v3 to -v4, and so the method we used was to take a clean version of mainline v4 and then apply our patches onto it afterwards, and that was a very long and very difficult process. Lots of device testing, again the TV devices being unique, lots of device specific issues coming up during testing, and so we can now in hindsight empirically say, well, actually if we'd had 10 times fewer patches to apply, that would be we'd be seeing a lot less device issues. There'd be a lot less testing required, a lot less dev work as well to actually apply the patches. So now we have the evidence, but I think even before we went through that journey, we do have a good relationship with our product managers. There's a lot of trust built up over working and collaborating with them over the years. Like, I know we've talked a lot about collaboration in the sense of open source and inner source, but cross-discipline collaboration is really important as well. Building those relationships and trust. So, especially in TV where it is such a specialist area, we have that relationship with product managers where if we say this is going to be really difficult on TVs, they kind of trust us and will understand the investment required to make the TV platform work, and that has extended to open source and to Dash.js. But even if someone's bought into something and agrees on the value, they may not agree on the priorities. So it's one thing to say, yes, we value this, yes, we want to invest in it, but it's a different thing to say, and we're going to prioritize that over all the product features we need to deliver for the big events of the year. And I think that's where the challenge comes in. So yeah, getting buy-in is fine, but getting priority against other things, especially if you've got other like technical-led things like we want to improve this technical debt, or we want to improve our CI/CD processes. We only get a certain amount of, I guess, bandwidth to do technical initiatives, and open source comes under that. I think actually this particular example I'm talking about kind of is technical debt. It's just you fix the technical debt in the open source instead of in your own code in this instance.
So you said that with that fix, you kind of have evidence that doing the upstream work reduces the maintenance cost downstream on your product side. Has that experience been helpful in terms of not just getting the buy-in, but also getting the priority and maybe rethink how the work on the production side is structured? So having that upstream work become part of the workflow as opposed to something that people just look at like it was flat out cost and overhead which in total it isn't.
Yeah, in terms of the buy-in, absolutely having that story to tell is really helpful. And yeah, making open source contributions part of just how you do your software rather than an afterthought, rather than a separate ticket, is I think where certainly I would like to see things. I think a really good example I always like is how when unit testing was not as ubiquitous as it is now, you would often get a ticket on the board to deliver the feature and then a separate ticket to add the unit tests. But now that we understand the value of the unit tests and how they are critical to actually delivering the software, the unit tests are included in there. And that's where I want to see open source going, where rather than just doing the upstream contribution as a separate ticket to be prioritized later, it's actually, well, no, let's do it the right way in the right place first time round. You need to have the expertise and the processes in place that you can do that with minimal cost and minimal overhead. But yeah, that is where I hope we're moving towards. In terms of prioritizing all of the work that's kind of, it's too late. We already did the deliver the product feature first and do the open source later, or we didn't even think about doing the open source later back then. Getting those prioritized is still difficult, because even though we've got the evidence, it's like, well, we've just taken V4, so V5, that's a little ways down the road, right? So we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, sort of thing. I think this is often the way with technical debt in general. You complete a product feature in a really difficult part of code, and you turn around and say, that would have been so much quicker if we'd solved this technical debt. And it's like, well, we're not going to be changing that for 6 months, so we don't need to do the technical debt for another 5 months, rather than addressing it straight after you've delivered the feature. I think, yeah, open source technical debt is just the same as normal technical debt in that way. This weird cycle of, well, we've just finished working in that area, so we're not going to be working in that area for some time now.
In this segment, Samson Goddy talks about his experience with different organizational structures and why you should not have open source strategy under the marketing department. You mentioned that sometimes open source things belong to marketing, and I did see that in the past too, like a role like director of open source. And then it turned out later, once they laid the person off, that it was, by the way, marketing budget. And then I realized why the person wasn't as successful with what they were trying to do, because they didn't really have a lot of leverage on the product engineering development side of things, where obviously everything that touches open source happens. How do you see that? Like, were you ever able to put enough influence through that marketing angle, or did you have a similar experience of just being a little boxed in and constrained in what you could and could not achieve?
Yeah, so I would say, to be fair, from a tactical point of view, I've always been successful with speaking marketing. It's something that I had to learn. But at some point, you're going to question yourself as an individual, and you're going to have the hard talk. Do you always want to be telling your manager what is open source 101 every single meeting? It's just up to you. Because at some point, because you report to marketing, the numbers And that's the funniest thing. Like in my previous role, I spend the least money. Sometimes I don't even spend any money at all. In fact, I type on an existing program and say, okay, how do my team make the most impact to make sure that I don't have to trigger my own budget? So for example, if they're trying to do like a developer's acquisition, I can come up like with an ambassador program, and that has a lot of like open source effort in it, right? But it can also translate to things that marketing will care about, like acquisition, or in this case, the marketing funnel. Get them, buying journey or whatever term they use. Again, the thing is, in my opinion, this role shouldn't be related to marketing at any point. In fact, if a developer's tool company, I think a lot of people need to learn from GitHub. I think GitHub org structure is a little bit better. I might be wrong, but I don't think they have the traditional marketing that typical company of their size or less do. All the open source DevRel teams are very product engineering based. Hence why there are a lot of sustainability. Then the ones that put it in marketing, it's not, trust me. At some point, even if you're good, you have to be careful that you're not selling. Because that's not the point. The point is to be as authentic as possible. But then someone is paying your bills. It's like very, very tricky. So I always tend to like what GitHub is doing with their org structure. I think it's a much relatable structure that I've seen so far. It's not the best, but it's one of the ones that I would say makes sense. That is, if you're an open source person or a DevRel person, the way they are with marketing, it's a little bit better.
In this segment, Federico Gonzalez Waite talks about how the Mexican government structures and coordinates the work around open source within agencies and the public sector within the country, including academia. When it comes to, creating the policies that we talked about at the beginning-ish of this conversation, and then figuring out the processes how the government can use and also invest in open source projects. Does the government have like any kind of a central group or organization like an open source program office who's helping with this, or is it happening per agency and per different departments of the government?
Like I mentioned before, there was this National Strategy Office, and they were kind of like coordinating this movement. And they were the ones that actually built this repository of open source technology built by the government that could be reused by the government. So they would be kind of like maybe the ones doing it at the time. We were doing it kind of like our own thing and creating these relationships with open source organizations. And I think at the end, we even became a member of Open Infra and this work with MIFOS. But those are kind of like the ones that I'm aware of. How will that be shaped now within this new national agency that's being built, that's being developed? And they should start. The decree has been issued last week, and they start work on the 1st of January. So how they're going to take this and how they're going to mold it and keep on launching it, I think is going to be very interesting. But yeah, those kind of like are the ones that I'm aware of at the moment.
So that there was that central organization, it wasn't just sort of in charge of the technology side, but also the concept of whether or not it is open source and how that is being applied.
Yeah, well, there were the central ones, and I guess also through this process of approval for the technological procurement processes and new technology development, I think that's also kind of like a way that it was coordinated, and that central body was always aware about what was kind of like going on in the different agencies. When the government's so big and so dispersed, it's very difficult to know what actually every single agency is. And there are probably other interactions that are happening, especially when it comes to academic institutions, no? Because we are aware also that like some of the universities have started with like their own software fabrics and looking at creating these links with open communities, but because they're also independent, some of them still get federal funding, but their legal statute or their legal figure makes them a little bit independent. Sometimes that also gets dispersed. But Mexico's a big country. We've got over 120 million people, a lot of states, a lot of big territory. So it's a little bit complicated sometimes to keep track of everything.
In this segment, Austen Bryan talks about his experience with open source transformation and why you should have software talent in-house. What did you find most challenging throughout the transition? Because you're talking about like a big transition period, and I assume that also leads back to like when you said a sentence or phrase around like looking back at, you know, the Kubernetes journey, like the fact that it's open source and that it's widely adopted, that they go hand in hand. But I assume that was not trivial to see at the very beginning when you didn't even know what Kubernetes was. And it sounds like that there is a much bigger scale, but similar realization as you've been going through that changing of that model of how you're making the contracts, how you're making the deals and business and partnership decisions. How did that process go? What did you find most challenging throughout the process?
I think anytime you try to do something that is new, people that you need support from, typically, and it's the same in any business, right? Your legal, your finance, there's these different disciplines. The same exists in government programs, right? There's an engineering faction and a finance faction and a contracting faction and a legal faction. You can't do anything alone, right? Like I as an engineer, even a program manager who even had money allocated that I could give, I can't sign the contracts. That's how the government's set up. So like you need a group of people to believe in what you're doing. The hardest part is convincing people to do this too. Like it is winning hearts and minds that it was the right thing to do. Because again, I'll go back to like people think you put out a giant proposal, you get a bunch of requests for proposal, you get a bunch of proposals back, you spend time in source selection evaluating them, you pick one giant company, you basically push the burden onto them to meet requirements, and then they figure out who to work with. And so a lot of times when you try to bring this idea to people, they're like, it would be so much easier if we just did this, which is the thing we've always done. And I don't want to say people didn't want to learn, but they just realized that it like more is more. Everybody's busy. It's hard for government to keep talent, and they only have so many hours in a day too. So typically like bringing this idea to them, you feel like you're trying to just explain to them like, hey, will you just do this thing differently? And you just meet a lot of resistance because it feels dangerous. It feels different. And so I think the biggest challenge was convincing people that this was the right thing to do. I think, you know, I guess how I would summarize is like 20, 30 years ago, major corporations, the Fortune 500, realized that like having some level of software talent in-house created the best business outcomes for them because they can make the trade space decisions at a minimum. If they're not developing things in-house, that's fine, but they know as much as any vendor provider what is right, what is good, what is bad. The government, unfortunately, I think at that time, and I think it's getting better now, was like, hey, we don't need software talent in-house. We contract that out. It's like any other company who said, hey, I'm going to do this thing, but all my contracted development is not here. It's an external business we're contracting with. Well, as you know, as people have been down that road, there's just so many inefficiencies. You make a mistake and you're stuck with it for a year and $20 million, right? It's a huge mistake. It may not feel like it at the time. And so convincing people to take like small contract bets with small companies and trying to integrate them with an integrator that understands software integration and portfolio management, that was a paradigm shift for people. And so just you end up just in hundreds of conversations between people at the Pentagon, people on Congress, people at your local program office, people who support your program office. You're in the same conversation over and over again. You feel like no matter what you say, people are like, no, it's too dangerous, too much work, give it to a prime, let them figure it out. And I'm like, we've done that for decades, and some of the things that are software intensive are not going well. The statistics are out there. You can go read them from GAO reports. And so you got to be willing to try new things. And I think unfortunately a lot of people don't want to try new things, and that problem is not specific to government. That's specific to any large organization. So I think winning hearts and minds.
In this segment, Federico Gonzalez Waite talks about the challenges of educating people about open source within government, and how the Mexican government has been benefiting from not just embracing, but also relying on open source software. I think you mentioned at one point that there are other governments who are kind of almost regulating against open source. And for example, there are legislations being put in place in Europe, like the Cyber Resilience Act, the Product Liability Directive, and some other things as well. And one of the criticisms that that they got is that, and I think it was also maybe a bit of a complaint from government officials' side, that they don't have the deepest understanding of open source, which is a challenge. Like someone in a government agency, if they've never been in touch with open source before, they never participated in a community, then it can be really hard to understand how that ecosystem works, how they can trust an open source project. Do you know how that initial education within the Mexican government happened?
See, I think it's always hard for. I think being a politician and having worked in the government, I think it's one of the hardest roles that you can ever have, because whatever decision you make, it's not like one size fits all. So whatever decision you take, it's going to harm somebody, or somebody's not going to agree on it. So while promoting open source, it probably could also affect your economic in the country, because you might be a technological development country, and losing the licensings of the European Union could be a very big impact, and jobs could be lost and these kind of things. So I think that's where kind of like policymakers they're stuck between two swords, and they have nowhere to go. When returning to the question like of how did the government did, I think it was the fact that the people that got to these kind of like leadership positions where we were shaping the technology of the country, we were aware of open source technology. So it wasn't kind of like a thing that they trained us for that. It was that we came from the world of open source. So we were already savvy on the topic. And this then helped to make other people aware of it. And I think when you have that plus the austerity plan where you have to reduce costs, and that was kind of like the presidential instruction, that's kind of like what gave us this result of actually making it put forward and making it a topic that would actually go into the law. Because I'm sure that if the austerity plan hadn't been so needed or so strict about reducing the expense of the government, then probably policies like this wouldn't have gone through. So it's kind of like one of those things of being on the right conditions at the right point of time with the right people and the right ideology. Right? So it's so getting that again, I think it's very difficult, but it happened for us, so it could happen anywhere.
I mean, I think it's a good example that when all these conditions are there at the same time, then something really good can come out of it. And it sounds like that it really just has been transforming the government and the country. In this segment, Michael Dexter talks about regulations and the effects that the creation of patents and copyright law had on software development and the free and open source software movement in the past.
Any thoughts on how that intersects with, interesting things like the Cyber Resilience Act that's coming up in the EU?
I'll say I've kind of buried my head on that one, because when I started getting involved with like SNIA, a storage organization that's very vendor neutral, I arrived when the GDPR freight train was coming May 1st or May something. I'll do a little gesture, and this train is coming at us, and everyone was panicking about how do we become compliant in some way. And it was a very well-intentioned set of guidelines, like the right to be forgotten and personal information protections. And I fully agree, but it also flipped the storage industry on its head. It sure didn't help, and this came up just this week and applies to an upcoming podcast where they hijacked the term data protection. So all of us, like files and blocks, RAID, sharding, whatever people are like, what do you mean personal medical data? Like, wait, no, that's not it. And then you add in the data protection of information security, and we have a term, data protection, that means three very different things to different people. And so I confess I've been not following what I understand to be about this liability that a volunteer might be treated like a vendor and with a legal team and a budget in the broader context of the protections offered to other companies or something. And maybe that was my, tell me how accurate that naive analysis of the one or two headlines I read about it was.
There was a time where that was a concern.
Okay.
And it did take, it was actually FOSDEM for the last 2 years.
Yep.
It has done a really good job of bringing the community together with the folks looking
Excellent.
to create the policy. And that is not there anymore. As far as where it's still a little bit muddy is when you have individuals who are willing to take a contract to provide support for a project that they know well, as a way of augmenting their livelihood. It's not their day job. But they're maintaining some project that's interesting to a variety of organizations, and so they sell the service of support for that. It's not a lot. It's an augmentation, but that then blurs what responsibility do they have in distributing that in general to Upstream. So there's still some work to be done there on some corner cases like that. And we're in the process now where, the actual bill has been approved and is now in place. And that literally happened like last week. When it finally got fully signed by Parliament. But now it's actually with several different standards bodies to actually turn the policy into what it's going to look like from a standard and what the actual expectations are. So there's still some more work to be done on the specifics, but a lot of the major concerns did get addressed, and that was a very good thing. It was a very good collaboration.
That is fortunate, and I'd hope we have some lessons from software patents, because flashback 10 years or so, software patents were going to end free software because any mathematical algorithm could simply read against some patent somewhere. And I understand those have softened quite a bit, which is super helpful for things like OpenCFS, which back when companies were proudly patenting everything they could simply to just build this prestige repo, not even sure what they're doing with it because they were freeing their software, yet they were so proud to protect it. And you get things like the CDDL license from Sun that's so complex to navigate the software patents, and it may indeed, and some will say it truly provided those protections, but if your average contributor or a new contributor just reads that license, they get lost a quarter or a third way into it. It's like, no, that's not it. And based on what you just said, I will broadly say that perhaps free software is and probably will remain a solid decade or two ahead of all the legislation that it bumps into. And free software is an absolute paradox. The more you explain it to someone, yes, rightfully, it makes less sense, but it works and it runs the world. So hopefully we have enlightened members of parliament and commissions, etc., in the EU, because I'm not convinced our domestic politicians are super aware of the subtleties between free software licenses and software patents and all the things that these are attempting to mitigate. They just understand that lawyers passing large amounts of money between one another. So I will do some reading on that. I am fascinated, but I sure just simply hope they get it right and don't hinder what we are all providing largely at no cost to everybody. It's like, that's the thing. Don't go after the volunteers. That's not in your interests.
Yeah, and actually it's the US has taken a slower approach, and they've actually been quite good at the collaboration part with the community. They put a couple of different calls for input in CISA. Ildiko and I actually know some of the folks that are doing that work on behalf of the government. And they're collecting a lot of good information before going forward and trying to make specific policy to get a really good understanding. So actually that's going really well. I guess I'll also mention that sadly, because of the ubiquity and the popularity of open source these days, there's a lot more non-practicing entities that are filing patent suits and accumulating patents and going after open source software and the companies that use it. So no, we're not done with the patent problem, particularly from non-practicing entities, often also called
about that term. Yeah, that's perfect. Yes.
Yeah, so sadly, that's actually getting worse.
Is it? I didn't realize that. Oh, okay.
Yeah, on the upside, there's an organization called Unified Patents, and they specifically work with the open source community to, for example, find prior art and to disqualify patents, so that it makes it much more difficult for those non-practicing entities to actually make good money on their strategy. And so that's one good defense and one good proactive defense that's been ongoing, and it's gaining momentum.
What was the patent alliance from 5 to 10 years ago, where companies would either pool
Open Invention Network?
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's still there. Okay, great. Good to know.
Yeah. OIN is still going.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, Steve Bergelt's still running it. He's actually working closely with these Unified Patent folks. And then there's a tie-in with the Linux Foundation as well, all working that to make it a better safe harbor.
Fantastic.
So yeah,
it only takes the three of us, at a minimum, half a decade to orient yourself in these things, and then a few decades to truly have a firm grasp, despite the fact that you learn something every single day. It is such an organic, massive, overwhelming enigma that is free software that that reminds me of just the wonderful notion that when it comes to people donating to sponsor software projects, never try to categorize and index and track their motivations, because their motivations are infinitely cleverly different, and just trust their motivation, their intentions, and just let it be, because we all have our reasons. Every business owner has their reasons. Every retiree has their reasons. Like, oh, I'm going to support this project because it's the opposite of the one they were using at work, or some who knows what. Just embrace that chaos, and great things come out of it. It's priceless.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for Season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source, and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned, because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, bullet, but no. Silver budget as well. Silver budget that is a silver bullet.
That's what you need, is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing's simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that, I don't know if you